Are the prices at the store, the gas station, or even your rent making you feel tight? We, the middle class, are having a hard time with inflation. It's changing how we live, work, and plan for the future. But why are prices really going up, and how are families dealing with the extra stress? The middle class is the group most affected by inflation, which is one of the major economic variables influencing the financial well-being of millions of Americans today. Inflation has increased in recent years to levels not seen in decades, which has reduced purchasing power, raised living expenses, and put further strain on households that already struggle with financial security. The pace of increase in prices for goods and services overall that lowers the purchasing power of money is known as inflation. In essence, less products and services are available for every dollar as inflation rises. The Consumer Price Index, which monitors variations in the cost of a basket of goods and services over time, is used to calculate inflation in the United States. Under typical economic circumstances, inflation happens at a modest rate, roughly 2% per year, which is thought to be beneficial for economic expansion. But if inflation rises faster than this, it can be harmful, particularly for people whose earnings are set or restricted. Because inflation impacts almost every element of middle-class families' finances, including housing, food, healthcare, education, and transportation expenses, it presents a serious challenge to them. The rise in inflation. What causes it? There are a number of interrelated factors that have contributed to the current spike in inflation. For instance, the global disruption of supply chains caused by the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in shortages of everything from home necessities to semiconductors. Prices naturally started to rise as economies reopened because there were fewer items available and demand was recovering. The enormous fiscal stimulus programs that governments around the world, including those in the United States, enacted to lessen the economic effects of the pandemic are another contributing element. Millions of Americans received much-needed relief from these actions, but they also significantly boosted the economy by adding to the demand for products and services. In addition, energy costs have skyrocketed due in part to supply shortages and geopolitical unrest. Families' transportation expenses are directly impacted by the recent surge in gasoline prices. Lastly, pay increases brought on by labor shortages in several industries have increased prices for corporations even though they are good for workers. These companies frequently raise their rates on customers in order to cover their increased costs. The effect on households in the middle class. Purchasing power erosion. The decline in purchasing power is one of the most obvious effects of inflation on middle-class Americans. In other words, middle-class families' income isn't going as far as it once did. Those whose earnings are stagnant should be particularly concerned about this. Even though some individuals have seen slight pay raises, these increases frequently fall short of inflation, which means that many people are really making less money than they did a year ago. A middle-class family's purchasing power has actually dropped if, for instance, their income grows by 3% over the course of a year, but inflation climbs by 5%. This makes it more difficult to pay for frivolous expenses like eating out or trips, let alone necessities like groceries, utilities, and gas. Increasing living expenses. Almost everything that middle-class people depend on to maintain their standard of living has become more expensive due to inflation. For example, rent and home prices have increased significantly in the housing market. The cost of renting an apartment has increased dramatically in many cities, while bidding wars and record-high home prices have made homeownership increasingly unaffordable for individuals wishing to purchase a property. Food prices have also increased dramatically. As the cost of staples like meat, dairy, and fresh vegetables has increased, grocery costs have also increased. Numerous families have been compelled by this to adapt their shopping routines, choosing to forego particular items entirely or substitute them with less expensive but less nourishing options. Another significant expense for middle-class families is healthcare, where costs have gone up as well. The cost of prescription medications, medical services, and health insurance has increased, making it more difficult for families to get the treatment they require without going bankrupt. Another sector severely affected by inflation is transportation. For those who depend on their cars to get to work, the rising cost of gas has increased the expense of commuting. The cost of public transit has increased in many places as well, which puts additional strain on household budgets. Effect on retirement and savings plans. Long-term financial planning is impacted by inflation in addition to daily spending. The value of savings for middle-class Americans attempting to save for retirement can be severely diminished over time by inflation. If a family continues to experience high rates of inflation, even with diligent contributions to a retirement account, their funds may have significantly less purchasing power when they retire. Similarly, inflation can be especially harmful to people whose retirement incomes are set, like Social Security or pensions. Cost of living adjustments, COLA, are used to adjust Social Security benefits for inflation. However, these increases frequently fall short of the actual rate of inflation, leaving pensioners with reduced purchasing power. Inflation also increases the difficulty of saving for college for families with children. Higher education has become increasingly unsustainable for many middle-class families due to the steady rise in tuition expenses that has been occurring for decades, which is further exacerbated by inflation. Middle-class coping strategies. Families in the middle class are being pushed to use a variety of coping mechanisms in order to make ends meet as inflation keeps rising. Among these tactics are the following: scaling down and budgeting. Families cutting costs is one of the most popular ways to deal with rising costs. In order to pay for needs, many middle-class households are making financial sacrifices in areas like entertainment, dining out, and vacation. In order to further stretch their food budget, families are also being more frugal with their grocery shopping, choosing generic brands, purchasing in bulk, and taking advantage of deals and coupons. Rising revenue. Some people in the middle class are looking for ways to raise their income in reaction to the financial strain that inflation has brought. This could entail beginning a side business, taking on a second job, or freelancing. Others are trying to keep up with the growing cost of living by looking for higher-paying positions or negotiating raises with their present companies. Though it can help counteract some of the consequences of inflation, raising income isn't always a practical solution, especially for people with busy schedules or full-time jobs. Using credit and savings as backup. Credit cards and savings are becoming popular options for middle-class families to bridge the gap between their income and expenses. Although this could help in the short run, it can cause long-term financial issues. When credit card debt is accumulated, especially when interest rates are high, it can easily become unsustainable. And when savings are depleted, families' emergency fund or future needs are less fulfilled. Modifying long-term budgets. In light of inflation, some families are being compelled to reconsider their long-term financial objectives. To make more money for present needs, people might postpone important life events like starting a family, buying a house, or retiring, or they might reduce their college or retirement savings plans. Even if these changes might be required in the near future, their effects on financial stability could be profound in the long run. Inflation's psychological costs. Inflation is having a psychological impact on middle-class Americans in addition to its financial effects. An ongoing source of stress brought on by growing costs and dwindling wages might induce feelings of dissatisfaction, pessimism, and worry. Many families experience a sense of powerlessness and discontent with their financial circumstances when they feel like they are working harder than ever, but are still slipping behind. Furthermore, social and economic inequality can be made worse by inflation. Richer households might be less impacted by rising costs, which would deepen the gap between the rich and the middle class, while middle-income families struggle to stay up. Increasing social separation and animosity can result from this, since many middle-class Americans believe that the economic system is biased against them. Government reaction and consequences for policy. There is increasing pressure on politicians to act as the middle class continues to be negatively impacted by inflation. In an attempt to curb inflation, the Federal Reserve has responded by hiking interest rates, but this has its own set of drawbacks. Borrowing becomes more costly with higher interest rates, which is bad for both consumers and businesses. An increase in mortgage and auto loan rates might put further financial hardship on middle-class families. In order to combat the growing expense of living, some lawmakers have also advocated for specific assistance for middle-class households, such as increased tax credits or direct stimulus payments. There is disagreement, nonetheless, regarding whether or not such actions, which increase the amount of money in the economy, could lead to additional inflation. There is no denying the impact of inflation on America's middle class. Millions of families are experiencing severe financial hardship as a result of inflation, which is reducing their purchasing power and raising living expenses. Inflation creates a special set of difficulties for the middle class, which frequently finds itself squeezed between growing expenses and stagnant wages. While budgeting, earning more money, and modifying long-term financial goals are some tactics families can employ to deal with the consequences of inflation, the truth is that many middle-class households are being pushed to make tough decisions. The path ahead is uncertain, but policymakers and government institutions have a critical role to play in combating inflation and its effects on the middle class. For the time being, middle-class households will have to deal with the effects of inflation while maintaining hope for a more secure and long-lasting economy. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the tips and insights you need to stay ahead. Join our community and let's navigate these challenges together.